Three shots. 11:18 p.m. A gas station off Route 9. A man reaching for his wallet. That is the whole distance between Officer Dale Pruitt and a prison cell. 3 shots, 11 seconds, and 1 sentence he spoke over the body in the rain, not into his radio, not to dispatch, but down at the man bleeding out on the wet concrete beneath him. Should have just stayed in your lane, boy. He believed no one would ever hear it. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about almost everything. But he wouldn't discover that for a while yet, not until a 24-year-old gas station clerk called an attorney from a payphone, not until a laptop was opened in a bathroom, not until a cloud server that Pruitt didn't know existed produced 47 minutes of overhead footage so clear you could read the expression on a dying man's face. And he certainly wouldn't discover it until the morning he walked into the Calhoun Falls District Courthouse in his gray suit and his American flag lapel pin, sat down at the defense table and smiled. The wrong smile at the wrong moment in front of the wrong jury, still absolutely certain after everything that Dale Pruitt was the kind of man things didn't happen to. He was wrong about that too. The man he shot was Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, 34 years old, 75th Ranger Regiment, United States Army, Bronze Star. Father of a 7-year-old girl named Zoe who drew pictures of her daddy in his Ranger beret and taped them to the sun visor of his car, who spelled her own name with 2 Z's because she had decided at age 6 that 2 Z's looked like lightning, and who was asleep on the living room couch with that beret clutched to her chest on the night a police cruiser rolled into a gas station lot without its headlights on, and a man who had survived 3 combat deployments did not survive 47 miles from home. Marcus was unarmed. He was reaching for his wallet. He said so out loud before he reached. And there was one thing Pruitt couldn't know, one piece he had no way of accounting for. Despite the crushed SD card and the wiped hard drive and the departmental press release and 17 years of the blue wall holding because it required knowing something about the kind of life Marcus Webb had lived and the kind of people that life had bound him to, people who were already moving before Pruitt ever put his hand on his holster. 14 of them were on a plane by the time the first news article ran. This is the story of what they found when they landed. He had been awake for 21 hours when he pulled into the Sunoco. The flight from Birmingham had been delayed twice, once for maintenance, once for weather stacking over Atlanta, and Marcus had spent both waits in a hard plastic airport chair, scrolling through the same 3 text messages from Rochelle. Zoe wants to know if you'll be home for dinner. I told her probably not. She said okay, but she's been carrying your beret around since noon. Then she fell asleep with it. I took a picture. You'll die. Then the picture itself. Zoe curled on the living room couch with his tan Ranger beret pressed against her chest like a stuffed animal, her face completely slack and trusting the way children sleep when the world has given them no reason not to trust it. He had looked at that picture for a long time in the Birmingham airport. He was still thinking about it somewhere over the dark middle of the country. Marcus was 34 years old and had spent 11 of those years in the Army, 9 of them in the 75th Ranger Regiment. 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq. He had been blown backward by an IED in the Korangal Valley and woken up in a field hospital asking about his platoon before asking about himself. He had carried a wounded 20-year-old Ranger named Dwayne Garrett, a kid from Memphis who'd been in-country 6 weeks 40 meters across open ground under direct fire, which was how he had earned the Bronze Star he kept in a shoebox in the hall closet because he did not like looking at it. He had never talked about any of this publicly. His mother knew. Rochelle knew. His commanding officer, Commander Victor Bryce, knew. Beyond that, Marcus kept it the way he kept most things close and quiet, and his own. He had been in Birmingham for 4 days visiting his father Gerald, who had suffered a mild stroke in October and was recovering with the aggressive stubbornness of a man who had been told he would need to slow down and had decided this applied to everyone around him but not to himself. Gerald walked Marcus to the cab on the last morning without his cane slowly and carefully, and held his son's hand at the door for a moment longer than necessary. "Come home more," Gerald said. "Not to check on me. Just come home." Marcus had been turning that sentence over in his mind on both flight delays and again over the dark country below, and again when he finally landed at Calhoun Falls Regional at 9:47 p.m., and collected the rental Tahoe and drove out into the cold November rain with 47 miles left between him and the kitchen table where Rochelle would be waiting with the lights low and something warming on the stove. He needed gas and he needed coffee. The Sunoco on Route 9 materialized out of the rain at 11:03 p.m. Fluorescent canopy-wet asphalt reflecting white light in long smears. One car at the far edge of the lot, probably belonging to the clerk, the pumps humming their steady mechanical hum. Marcus pulled to pump 3, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden quiet. He looked up at the sun visor. Zoe's drawing was there, taped flat with a strip of masking tape she had applied herself, pressing each corner down with the pad of her thumb, and then checking it with a focused professional seriousness that Marcus had recognized as entirely his daughter's own particular temperament. Their family. Rochelle tall and smiling, Marcus taller in his beret, Zoe between them with her stick arms raised like she was already celebrating something. And above them, a sun with spikes radiating in every direction, chaotic and impossibly bright. "I know the sun doesn't really work that way," Marcus had told her. "I know," Zoe had said. "But in my picture, it does." He got out. He swiped his card, put the nozzle in the tank, and leaned against the side of the Tahoe with his hands in his hoodie pocket, watching the numbers climb. The rain was light and cold and regular against the back of his neck. He was thinking about Zoe's beret and Gerald's handshake and the specific warmth of a house when someone is awake in it waiting for you. He did not hear the cruiser cut its headlights 2 blocks away. He had been sitting in a hardware store parking lot for 40 minutes, eating a double cheeseburger and scrolling his phone when the Tahoe pulled into the Sunoco. Officer Dale Pruitt of the Calhoun Falls Police Department had been on shift since 7 p.m. and was bored in the way he was usually bored on Tuesday nights, not restlessly, not anxiously, but with a low and specific resentment that had nowhere to go. He did not like Tuesdays. He did not like the absence of incident. He had built his professional identity around the resolution of incident, and nights without it felt like proof of something he could not name but deeply disliked. He was 46 years old, 17-year veteran badge number 0442, and at the precinct they called him the Closer. He had earned the nickname in his 8th year after a string of aggressive arrests in the Riverside District cleared 4 open cases in 1 week. He wore the name the way some men wear a tattoo as permanent evidence of a truth about himself that he did not want questioned. Dale Pruitt closed things, settled things, put the period at the end of other people's sentences. What also existed alongside the nickname and the 17 years and the 5 departmental commendations was a file in internal affairs that contained 9 separate complaints filed over 14 years by 9 separate citizens. Excessive force, racial intimidation, unlawful search, threatening behavior. A planted evidence allegation that had evaporated when the complainant accepted a plea and declined to pursue it further. Union Rep Chip Holloway had handled each complaint with efficient cheerfulness. The disposition letters all used the word procedural. The file existed, and the complaints had been resolved, and nothing about Dale Pruitt had changed because nothing about Dale Pruitt was ever required to change. He had come to understand this the way a man understands a scar, as evidence of something that had already healed, that would not reopen, that was simply part of the territory now. He watched the Tahoe pull to pump 3. He watched the driver's door open. A tall black man stepped out. Athletic, deliberate gray hoodie, dark jeans, moving with the kind of contained physical precision that Pruitt's brain flagged without his conscious mind articulating why. He ran the plates. The system returned a routine administrative hold, a common database glitch with rental agencies that triggered automatically on vehicles processed through overlapping registration windows. It was not a criminal flag. It was not even a procedural flag in any meaningful sense. A single call to the rental agency's fleet desk would have resolved it in 90 seconds. Pruitt put the cheeseburger wrapper in the bag and killed his headlights. He rolled the cruiser out of the hardware store lot and across the Route 9 intersection without his lights on, entering the Sunoco at a shallow angle that boxed the Tahoe in on the driver's side and partially blocked its rear exit. He did not call it in to dispatch first. He did not slow down as he approached. He simply stopped where he intended to stop in the position he intended to occupy and opened his door. There are men who wear a badge as a responsibility and men who wear it as a license. Pruitt had been drifting from the first category into the second for years without recognizing the distance he had traveled. He was not calculating cruelty in the operatic sense. He was something more mundane and more dangerous, a man who had been told so many times through so many small institutional confirmations that his instincts were correct and his authority was total, that he could no longer distinguish between what was lawful and what he simply wanted to do. He stepped out into the rain. The first thing Marcus noticed was not the lights. The first thing was the angle. The way the cruiser sat between him and the road, between him and the exit, its front bumper overlapping the rear corner of the Tahoe. He registered it the way a man registers a change in wind direction in open ground, not as a consciously analyzed threat, but as a fact the body processes ahead of the mind, a change in the atmosphere that the nervous system notes and catalogs before the intellect catches up. His hands came up before Pruitt spoke. Not high, not theatrical chest height, palms, open fingers, spread. Visible. It was muscle memory. The automatic response of 9 years of training applied to the wrong war in the wrong country, and it was the most important thing that happened in the next 6 minutes. Step away from the vehicle. The voice came through the cruiser's PA. Before Pruitt had fully exited hard flat carrying a hostility that was not the tightness of genuine alertness, but the looseness of a man who had already decided what this was going to be. Evening, officer. Marcus kept his hands at chest height and turned toward the light. His voice was level, projected clearly without aggression, the voice of a man who understood that tone was the first variable in any volatile encounter. Is there a problem? Pruitt moved toward him in the specific way of a man reclaiming territory, not the alert, careful approach of someone responding to a real threat, but the deliberate stride of someone demonstrating ownership of space. He stopped 6 feet away, with his hand resting on his holster, and looked Marcus up and down with the unhurried assessment of someone inspecting something expected to be defective. "My wallet is in my back right pocket," Marcus said, keeping his hands visible and his voice even. "I have my military ID and my driver's license. I'm waiting for your instruction before I reach for them." "Shut your mouth." Pruitt closed the remaining distance. The rain was beginning to slick his hair to his forehead. His eyes had the quality Marcus had seen before, darting, restless, not finding what they were looking for because what they were looking for did not exist. "Do not reach. Turn around. Hands on the roof." Marcus turned. He placed both hands on the wet metal roof of the Tahoe, spread his fingers, kept them still. "I am an active duty military officer," he said. His voice calm, each word deliberate. "My wallet has my military ID. I can show you when you're ready." "I didn't ask what you are." Pruitt moved to his left shoulder, entering Marcus's blind zone, and his voice dropped. "Get your ID. Show me your ID. You just told me to keep my hands on the roof." A pause, not defiant, not angry, factual. A man attempting to solve a problem that had been deliberately made unsolvable. "Which do you want? I'll do either one. Just tell me. Don't you talk back to me. I'm asking for a clear instruction. I'll do exactly what you say." Pruitt lunged, both hands seizing the back of Marcus's hoodie, yanking sideways with a force that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with domination. Marcus's hip hit the side mirror. He spread his feet against the wet pavement, tensed his core, absorbed the impact without falling and without responding. He did not grab back. He did not swing. He planted and held. "He's resisting, Pruitt," shouted to the empty parking lot, to the rain, to the body camera he believed was recording. "Stop resisting. I'm not resisting." Marcus's voice was tight now, controlled with effort. His forehead 3 inches from the side window. The rain ran down the back of his neck. "I am standing still. My right hand is going to move slowly toward my back pocket to get the ID you asked for. That is all that is happening." "Gun." Pruitt said the word in a specific way, dropped compressed like something he was pulling from a drawer he had already opened. "He's reaching." The shots came before Marcus's hand reached his pocket. 3 rounds at 11:18 p.m. The detonation of a handgun at close range is not a sound. It is a physical event, a pressure wave that rearranges the air and the body's relationship to what is real. Marcus went back and down, his hands catching the roof of the Tahoe on the way, and then the wet concrete, and he lay on his back in the rain with the fuel pump still running behind him, and the fluorescent lights buzzing above, and the numbers still climbing on the display at pump 3, as if nothing had changed. He did not reach for his wounds. He turned his head. Through the rain-beaded glass of the Tahoe's window, still taped to the sun visor by its corners, was Zoe's drawing. The family beneath the impossible sun, the stick arms raised, and in the lower corner, her name in her own handwriting, 2 Z's, the way she had been writing it for months, because she had decided 2 Z's looked like lightning, and lightning was faster than regular letters, and when you were 7 years old and had thought of something like that, you did not stop using it just because other people spelled differently. Marcus looked at her name, and the rain fell on his face, and the lights above were very white and very steady, and did not flicker. Above him, Pruitt stood. He did not kneel. He did not call for help. He did not press his hands against anything. He stood over Marcus Webb, and he looked at him, and he breathed rapid, shallow, the specific breathing of a man whose body has done something large and whose mind is catching up to what it means. He looked at the wallet that had fallen half out of Marcus's back right pocket. He looked at the absence of anything else. He stood there for 11 seconds. Later at trial, the forensic pathologist would testify that prompt intervention during those 11 seconds would have materially altered the probability of survival. The wounds were survivable. The delay was not. Pruitt grabbed his radio. Shots fired. Shots fired. His voice was already assembling the report, the language of incident documentation clicking into place before the moment had even ended. Suspect reached for a weapon. "I need EMS forthwith." Inside, the Sunoco Danny Fuentes was flat on the linoleum floor behind the counter, with his tablet pressed against his chest. He had knocked over an entire rack of air fresheners when the shots came, and had been lying still since, his heart beat loud in his own ears, the live camera feed still glowing on the screen against his ribs. He was 24 years old and had grown up in a neighborhood where you learned early what you did immediately after hearing gunshots. Nothing visible, nothing loud. He lay still and waited. Sergeant Glenn Staver arrived 4 minutes and 20 seconds later, not blind, not random, not a supervisor responding to an unknown call. He was Pruitt's closest professional ally. His partner of 4 years before Staver's promotion, the man who had been his best man 12 years ago. He arrived and went to Pruitt first. He walked the scene. He went to the body. He crouched and checked for a pulse he didn't find. He looked at the entry wounds, the hoodie, the concrete. He looked at the back right pocket of Marcus's jeans and the wallet that was halfway out of it. He opened the wallet. The Department of Defense military identification card was on top. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, 75th Ranger Regiment. Staver stood. He walked back to Pruitt under the canopy and looked at him for a long moment. A man running a calculation. A man at a fork. Harlan Staver said quietly, "He's clean. He's Army. He's a sergeant." Something moved behind Pruitt's eyes, a brief, rapid arithmetic that resolved itself almost instantly into the language of self-preservation. I saw something. Maybe he kicked it under the car. It was dark. It was raining. Staver nodded once. "Go sit in my cruiser," Staver said. "Don't talk to anyone else." He walked to the Sunoco's front door and pushed it open. Danny heard the bell and rose slowly from behind the counter. Staver showed his badge. His expression was not unkind. It was professional in the specific way of a door closing. "Son, I need you to step out of the back area. Go wait by the front door. Active investigation." Danny went. Staver spent 6 minutes in the security equipment room. When he walked out, the DVR unit was under his arm. He logged it into evidence that night. By the following week, the hard drive had been wiped with a rare earth magnet that Staver kept in a box in his garage for the kind of thing that required it. EMS arrived at 11:29. Marcus Webb was pronounced dead at 11:58. There was one more call made that night that Staver did not know about. At approximately the same moment, Staver was walking Danny out of the back room. Marcus's phone, still in his hoodie pocket, still warm, received an incoming call. Nobody answered it. The caller, whose name was saved in Marcus's contacts as CO, left no voicemail. He tried twice more before midnight, and when the calls went unanswered, he did not go to sleep. He opened his laptop. He searched the news wires for Calhoun Falls, South Carolina. He found a 2-paragraph report from a local CBS affiliate about an officer-involved shooting on Route 9. He read it once. He closed the laptop. He picked up his phone and began making calls of his own. By morning, 14 men had been notified. By the following evening, 12 of them had booked flights. The blue wall does not go up all at once. It is built one brick at a time, each brick set before the mortar of the one before it has dried, each action making the next feel more necessary and more inevitable. By the time you stand back and look at what you have constructed, it is already load-bearing, and you cannot take any one piece out without threatening the rest. Pruitt and Staver had 40 minutes before the crime scene unit arrived, and in those 40 minutes, the wall went up. They agreed on language: non-compliant, erratic, furtive movement toward the waistband. Officer feared for his life. The specific phrases that Internal Affairs recognized, that county prosecutors recognized, that had appeared in the disposition letters of Pruitt's 9 prior complaints and had functioned there as the exact words required to make a problem administrative rather than criminal. The language was not invented that night. It had already existed, had been used, and had worked, and Pruitt knew its architecture the way a man knows the floor plan of his own house. The body camera, Pruitt had already handled that. He told Staver about the SD card as they stood under the canopy. Staver did not respond. He looked at the rain. He moved on. The following morning, Chief Raymond Galt stood on the precinct steps in his dress uniform and read from a prepared statement. He expressed deep condolences for the loss of life. He used the word unfortunate twice. He described the event as an officer-involved shooting following a confrontation with a non-compliant suspect in which Officer Pruitt had acted in accordance with his training and in reasonable fear for his life. He did not mention Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb by rank. He did not mention the Bronze Star, the Ranger Tab, the 3 deployments, the 9 years, or the wallet. He mentioned that Officer Pruitt was on paid administrative leave pending an internal review. Union Rep Chip Holloway issued his statement at noon. It contained the phrase "tragic but justified use of force." At 1:14 in this morning, before any of this had been assembled, Rochelle Webb had opened her front door to a Calhoun Falls detective and a military notification officer in dress uniform and had known from their faces and their posture and the hour what they were there to say. She sat down on the porch steps in her robe. The notification officer said the words. She listened. She did not cry. She looked at the bare November tree in the yard and thought about Zoe asleep upstairs with Marcus's beret against her chest, and she thought about the fact that she was going to have to be the one to explain this to a 7-year-old who spelled her own name with lightning. She did not move for 45 minutes. When she finally went inside, she went to the kitchen table, turned on the light, and began making a list of things she needed to do. At the top of the list, in capital letters, find out what really happened. Local D, Boyd Tremaine, announced within 13 days of the shooting that he would not convene a grand jury. He cited insufficient evidence of criminal intent. He had been playing golf with Chief Galt every Saturday morning for 11 years. Simone Langford had taken Rochelle's case without a retainer on the afternoon of the press release. She filed for the body camera footage and the dash cam immediately. Both came back compromised. She filed for the Sunoco security footage. The department produced the DVR unit. The hard drive had been wiped clean, a power surge during storage per the evidence log. No technical report, no chain of custody documentation beyond the log entry itself signed by Staver. Langford hit the wall everywhere she turned, and then her phone rang. Danny Fuentes called from a payphone 3 weeks after the shooting. He had been carrying what he knew the way some people carry an injury, aware of it, constantly adjusting his movement around it, unable to pretend it wasn't there. He had read about Langford in the newspaper in the article, where she described the missing footage, and he had spent 3 weeks trying to decide whether calling her was brave or suicidal, and had finally concluded that not calling her was worse. He told her about the cloud backup the franchise owner's redundant system installed 6 months prior that simultaneously uploaded to a secure offsite server. He told her about the SD card. He told her about watching on his tablet in real time from directly overhead at Pump 3. The officer attacked him, Danny said from the payphone, his voice low. The man never reached for anything dangerous. He just stood there. Langford drove to his apartment that night with a laptop and 2 flash drives. They used his neighbor's Wi-Fi. She watched the footage twice in her car in the parking lot afterward, alone, before she started the engine. The footage was 47 minutes of overhead time-stamped continuous record from a camera that had no agenda. It showed Marcus at the pump calm, ordinary, alive. It showed the cruiser entering without headlights. It showed Marcus's hands going up immediately. It showed the approach, the grab, the shots, and it showed with terrible and unambiguous clarity the 11 seconds afterward. Langford drove directly to a payphone of her own. She called Conrad Marsh, the state attorney general, whose direct line she had because they had worked across from each other on a consent decree 4 years prior. Conrad, she said when he picked up, "I have something you need to see tonight. Bring your deputy." But before she dialed, she made one other call. She had been in contact with someone else since the 2nd week of the investigation, someone who had reached out to her, not the other way around. Someone who had things to say about Marcus Webb that went beyond a commanding officer's character statement and who had been quietly building something in parallel for weeks. Commander Victor Bryce answered on the first ring. "We have the footage," Langford said. A pause. Then, "We're ready." The grand jury was convened in secret within 72 hours of Langford's call to Marsh. Members selected from a pool that excluded Calhoun Falls proper. No advance notice to the department. The footage was shown. The forensic pathologist's report was presented. The evidence log from the DVR with its absence of processing timestamps and chain of custody documentation was entered. The grand jury deliberated for 55 minutes. The indictment named Dale Pruitt on 3 counts murder in the 1st degree. Official misconduct and conspiracy to tamper with evidence. It named Glenn Staver on 2 conspiracy to tamper with evidence and obstruction of justice. Pruitt had been spending his administrative leave making home improvement projects and watching football. Holloway had called twice to assure him the trajectory was favorable. He genuinely believed he was going home. The pre-dawn state police tactical entry team did not knock with the expectation of being answered. Pruitt heard the knock and the door within the same breath, and then he was on his kitchen floor with his arms behind him and his cheek against the linoleum, while his wife screamed from the top of the stairs and his 2 teenage sons watched from the hallway and calculated in real time what this meant. Staver was arrested at the precinct in front of the morning shift, which was worse. What Pruitt did not know, what he could not have known, because knowing it required understanding something about Marcus Webb that Pruitt had never bothered to understand about any of the people he stopped, was the call. On the night Marcus died at approximately 11:04 p.m., 14 minutes before the shots, Marcus had called Commander Victor Bryce from the airport parking lot. He had just retrieved the rental Tahoe. He had been on the phone for 3 minutes and 40 seconds, according to Bryce's carrier records. In that call, Marcus had described something he had noticed as he left the terminal, a patrol cruiser without headlights running slowly behind him for 2 blocks. He had not been alarmed. He had in 9 years learned to note and catalog things rather than panic at them. He mentioned it to Bryce the way he might mention weather as useful information. Bryce had said, "Just document it. You know the drill." Marcus had said, "Yeah, I'll call you when I'm home." He had not called. The call Bryce made at 11:42 p.m. went unanswered. He searched the news wires. He found the 2-paragraph report. Those 3 minutes and 40 seconds Marcus flagging the dark cruiser, Bryce saying document it, the line going dead, were on record at Bryce's carrier. They would remain there, subpoenaed and authenticated, until the day Bryce sat in a witness chair and said them out loud. Pruitt had not just shot a stranger, he had shot a man whose commanding officer had his last words on record. A man who had seen the cruiser coming and had noted it, and who had, even in noting it, done exactly what his training told him, stayed calm, kept moving, trusted the protocol. The trap had not been set by lawyers or attorneys general. It had been set by Marcus himself in the 3 minutes and 40 seconds before Dale Pruitt turned off his headlights. Pruitt didn't know any of this on the morning the tactical team came through his door. He didn't know it in the county holding facility. He didn't know it on the first day of trial when he sat down in his gray suit and arranged his face into something resembling appropriate gravity. He was going to find out in a courtroom in public with the cameras running. The Calhoun Falls District Courthouse on the morning of October 14th was an institution under the pressure of its own consequence. Concrete barriers along the front approach, state troopers in pairs at every entrance, 7 network news trucks lining the perimeter satellite arrays aimed at the pale October sky. By the time the doors opened, the crowd stretched 2 blocks in both directions. Protesters, community members who had driven from neighboring counties, people who needed to be physically present for something, who understood that presence was a form of witness. Inside the courtroom was old wood and institutional light, and the ambient weight of a room where consequential things had happened repeatedly. Judge Patricia Okafor sat behind the elevated bench with the stillness of a woman who required no performance of authority because she possessed the actual thing. 14 years on the federal bench, 11 before that as a federal prosecutor, 6 before that as a public defender. She had a complete map of every way the legal system could be navigated honestly and every way it could be gamed, and she had demonstrated repeatedly that she found the latter genuinely offensive. Defense attorney Parker Ellison sat at the right-hand table with a file of precedents and a reputation built on 2 prior officer acquittals. Silver-haired, expensively suited, the practiced calm of a man who had done this before and won. He had coached Pruitt carefully for months. The gray suit, the subdued expression, the American flag pin, the choreography of a grieving public servant rather than a confident one. He had done everything right in the preparation, and he was about to discover that it was not enough. Pruitt sat beside him. He had lost 7 pounds in county detention. His face was slightly drawn, the comfortable cushion of untested certainty eroded by months of waiting. But the smile was still appearing reflexive, wrong-timed, visible to anyone looking for it. It appeared when he caught the eye of a union representative in the gallery. It appeared when Ellison made a point during a sidebar. It appeared and told the jury something that 3 days of defense testimony would fail to undo. At the prosecution table, Attorney General Conrad Marsh sat with his lead deputy and 2 researchers, and beside him, permitted by Judge Okafor as a civil party, with standing sat Rochelle Webb. Black dress, On her lapel, a small Gold Ranger tab pin she had cleaned and worn every day since finding it in Marcus's keepsake box. Under the table on her lap, pressed flat between both palms, a laminated 4x6 photograph Marcus and Zoe at a Georgia beach 2 summers ago. Marcus in a blue t-shirt squinting into the sun, laughing at something just outside the frame. Zoe on his shoulders with her arms spread wide and her face tipped back, as if she were already in flight, completely certain he would not let her fall. Judge Okafor called the court to order. The trial of the state of South Carolina versus Officer Dale Pruitt began. Ellison's opening statement was the best possible version of an argument built on a foundation it could not ultimately support. He was careful, measured, emotionally calibrated. He acknowledged Marcus's service with what appeared to be genuine respect. He did not reach for explicit racial framing. He built a single frame and stayed inside it. A good officer made a terrible human mistake in the dark, and the rain and the law required the jury to weigh what the officer perceived in the moment, not what the footage showed from above afterward. He spoke about action-reaction gap, about tunnel vision, about the inherent and documented difficulty of police work in high-stress environments. He was professional. Several jurors nodded. Then he called his use of force experts. They were credentialed and articulate and effective at their specific task, seeding ambiguity in the first week, making the jury feel that what seemed obvious might be complicated. They talked about threat perception lag and auditory exclusion under adrenaline and the documented phenomenon of officers misidentifying reaching movements under stress. They did not address the 11 seconds. Every time Marsh raised it in cross-examination, Ellison objected. Okafor sustained him. The 11 seconds were coming. Marsh was holding them. His first-week witnesses were methodical and specific. The medical examiner, no weapon recovered wallet, in the back right pocket wound trajectory consistent with a man rotating toward his posterior, not lunging forward. The paramedic, she described the 11-second gap in clinical precise terms and described the intervention window it represented. The police training expert, a retired state police lieutenant with 30 years of experience and zero relationship to the Calhoun Falls Department, walked the jury through 4 specific de-escalation protocols that Pruitt had violated before the first command was given. By the end of the first week, cable legal analysts split 60-40 that Pruitt would not be convicted. One said on a Thursday evening program that the prosecution hasn't yet made the case that this was murder rather than a catastrophic mistake. He was not wrong. Yet. Pruitt's smile was appearing less frequently. He was still confident Holloway had told him the trajectory was manageable, that the union's legal fund was ready, that Ellison had done this before. But the first week had produced a specific kind of atmospheric shift in the courtroom that Pruitt could feel without being able to name. He felt it in the way the jury looked at him when the paramedic described the 11 seconds. He felt it in the way Okafor looked at Ellison when he objected to the training expert's testimony about the pre-stop approach. He told himself it was nothing. He was wrong about that. There was one more piece that nobody on his side of the table knew about yet. Not Ellison, not Holloway, not the union's legal team. Marsh had kept it back deliberately, held it for the sequence that would matter most. Something from Marcus's world, not from the legal systems. Something that required the jury to understand exactly what had been lost before they could fully understand what had been done. Marsh called Danny to the stand on the second Monday morning of trial, and the first thing that struck everyone in the gallery was how young he looked in the witness chair. 24 years old in a gray suit that didn't fit him quite right, slightly too wide in the shoulders, the sleeves a quarter-inch too long, sitting with his hands folded on his knees and his eyes moving carefully around the room, cataloging the exits and the authority figures, the way a person does when they have grown up learning that rooms like this one were not generally safe for people who looked like him. He had purchased the suit specifically for this. He had practiced what he was going to say in front of a mirror in his apartment bathroom for 2 weeks. Marsh walked him through it with unhurried patience. Employment, role, the night of November 9th, the tablet, the live feed. I could see all the pumps from inside, Danny said. We used the tablet to monitor the station during slow shifts. He described what he saw with a specificity that Ellison could not rattle the Tahoe at Pump 3. The man stepping out, the cruiser entering without headlights, the spotlight, the man's hands coming up immediately, the approach, the contradictory commands, the grab, the shots. His hand was going back. Danny said, his voice steady in a way that seemed to cost him something. Not forward. He said his wallet was in his back pocket and his hand was going toward his back pocket. From the camera angle directly above it was clear. Ellison's cross was structured as expected. Danny had waited 3 weeks to come forward. He'd been frightened. He had no formal law enforcement training. He'd been watching a screen, not the actual encounter. Danny listened to each point with the patience of someone who had anticipated them. Then he looked at Ellison and said, "A police officer had just shot a man in front of me. Another officer came into the store, stood next to his gun, and told me I didn't see anything. Who was I supposed to call? The Oak Creek police?" A ripple moved through the jury box. Ellison changed direction quickly. He pivoted to the footage. The DVR had been stipulated as corrupted. Any cloud backup was hearsay without proper authentication chain. He moved to exclude. Marsh stood. He explained that the cloud backup had been authenticated by the franchise owner, who installed the system by 2 independent digital forensics specialists and by a cybersecurity consultant from the firm that built the architecture. He noted that all 3 authentication declarations had been filed in discovery. He noted that the footage itself had been included in the initial digital archive transfer to the defense 4 months ago, in a folder labeled Remote Server Redundancy, Backup Pump Camera Array, November through December. The folder was included in a terabyte transfer sent to Mr. Ellison's office on record. Marsh said, "It is not the state's responsibility if the defense did not review the evidence they were provided." The pencil in Ellison's hand broke under his fingers. He did not look down at it. "The evidence is admitted," Okafor said. "Play the footage, Mr. Marsh." This was the first domino. Pruitt had known the body cam was gone. He had crushed it himself. He had believed the DVR was gone. Staver had taken it, had wiped it. He had believed the gas station had no other eyes. He had been wrong about all of it, and the moment the screen descended from the ceiling, he understood fully, finally, with the specific clarity of a man watching the walls close in, that everything he had counted on had been built on a single miscalculation about a cloud server he had never thought to ask about. The courtroom lights dimmed at 10:47 a.m. The room did not make a sound. 200 people stopped breathing simultaneously in the way they stop breathing before something they know will be irreversible. The footage was silent. That was the first thing. There was no audio, no screaming, no commands, no confusion to fill in the gaps. There was only the overhead camera, time-stamped, continuous, indifferent. A machine that recorded what happened within its cone without opinion, without training, without 17 years on a police force, without any of the things that had shaped the narrative constructed at the Sunoco on the night of November 9th. The timestamp in the upper left corner read 11:03:44 p.m. Marcus Webb pulled the Tahoe to Pump 3. He stepped out. He swiped his card. He leaned against the car while the pump ran hands at his sides. The neon lights above him were steady. The rain was visible as a fine, constant texture across the frame. At 11:06:02, a vehicle entered the frame from the lower left. No headlights. It came in at an angle that was not the natural approach of a car finding an available space, but the specific placement of a car being used as a physical barrier. The geometry of it was visible from overhead with a clarity that no ground-level perspective could match. At 11:06:28, the spotlight activated. Marcus turned. At 11:06:29. 1 second after the spotlight hit him, both of Marcus's hands were at chest height, palms open, fingers spread. 1 second. Marsh did not narrate this. He let it sit in the room. Pruitt walked toward him in the frame. The jury could see the hand on the holster, the elbow angled outward, the specific posture of a hand that was resting on a weapon rather than hanging at a side. They could see Marcus communicating his posture, completely open, his head moving as he spoke. They could see Pruitt's pace. It did not slow. It did not have the measured quality of an approach to an uncertain situation. It had the compressed, direct quality of a man who had already made his decision. At 11:08:53, Pruitt grabbed Marcus, both hands a yanking motion. Marcus's hip caught the mirror. The jury watched his response feet spreading on the pavement core, engaging the absorption of a violent impact without a counter-movement. He did not grab back. He did not swing. He planted. At 11:09:14, Marcus's right hand began to move. From directly overhead, the trajectory was entirely visible. 2 fingers extended, moving toward the lower right quadrant, toward the back right pocket of his jeans. Not the front, not the waistband. At 11:09:15, Pruitt drew. At 11:09:16, 3 muzzle flashes, white bursts against the wet, black asphalt. And then the timestamp continued. 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27. Pruitt did not move during those 11 seconds. He stood, he watched, he breathed. At 11:09:27, he reached for his radio. When the lights came back up, the room had the quality of a space in which something permanent had just been established. In the second row of the jury box, a woman in her 50s pressed both hands flat against the wooden railing in front of her. Her eyes were wet. She did not look at Pruitt. At the defense table, Pruitt stared at the blank screen. His practiced expression was gone. What remained was something more animal, the recognition of a man who has just understood the actual dimensions of the trap he is in. The smile did not come back. Rochelle had not watched the footage. She had sat with her eyes closed and her hands pressed around the laminated photograph on her lap, and she had listened to the silence of 200 people, watching the worst 11 seconds of her life play on a screen in a public room. When the lights came back, she opened her eyes, looked at the blank screen, and looked at the exhibit table where Marcus's military ID sat in its evidence sleeve. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at her hands. Ellison put Pruitt on the stand the following morning because there was nothing else left. The footage had not destroyed the case. That was not how juries worked, and Ellison knew it. Juries were human, and human psychology was complicated, and men and women in jury boxes had before now watched damning footage and still found reasons. But the footage had narrowed the available defenses to one psychological state, what Pruitt believed in the moment, the space between what happened and what he thought was happening. If that space was large enough, it might constitute reasonable doubt. Pruitt performed the defense well. The gray suit, the smaller-looking frame, the humility about his career, the appropriate weight when he spoke Marcus's name, the vulnerability of a man describing fear in a dark parking lot in the rain. He spoke about tunnel vision and auditory exclusion and the documented phenomenon of split-second threat assessment. And he looked at the jury when he said, "I thought I was never going to see my family again." Several jurors held his gaze. Ellison had done his work. Then Marsh stood up. He did not go to the podium. He walked to the center of the well with the remote control and stood there in silence for a moment. "Mr. Pruitt," he said, "you testified that Staff Sergeant Webb was non-compliant. Let's look at the footage." He paused the video at 11:06:29, 1 second after the spotlight, Marcus's hands at chest height. "This is 1 second after your spotlight activated. Are his hands visible?" "Yes." "They're up, palms open. Before you gave any instruction, play forward." The footage moved. Marcus communicating visibly. Hands never dropping. Pause. At any point in this sequence is there a moment in which Staff Sergeant Webb's hands are not visible? Silence. "Mr. Pruitt, is there a moment?" He was moving. I asked about hand visibility. Is there a moment where his hands are not visible? No. Play forward. Quarter speed. The footage crawled. Marcus's hand beginning its movement, 2 fingers deliberate, announced. You testified you saw him reach for his waistband. In this footage from directly overhead at quarter speed is his hand moving toward the front of his waistband. Pruitt's jaw tightened. The angle from where I was standing was... I'm not asking about your angle. I am asking what is happening in objective reality in this frame. Is his hand moving toward his waistband? A pause that the entire room could feel. No, Pruitt said. It's moving toward his back pocket, where he told you his wallet was. No response, where he announced verbally and in advance his intention to move. Marsh walked slowly back toward his table. He picked up a document without breaking stride. You also testified that your body camera was dislodged during the confrontation. This is the forensic metallurgy report from the State Crime Laboratory describing the fracture pattern on the SD card recovered from the Sunoco parking lot, not from a camera housing, but from the asphalt 2 feet from your standing position immediately after the shooting. The report concludes the card's structural failure is consistent with flat, even pressure applied by a boot heel. It is inconsistent with an impact from a fall. He set the document on the jury box railing and looked at Pruitt. Would you like to revise your testimony? What happened next was not planned. It was not Ellison's strategy, and it was not Pruitt's calculation. It was the failure of a container that had been holding something under pressure for too long. You don't know what it's like, Pruitt said. His voice had changed. The prepared modulation was gone, replaced by something rawer, something that had been sitting beneath the 7-pound weight loss and the coached expression and the gray suit since the night in November when he had stood over a man for 11 seconds. You're in here in your suits and you're telling me what I should have done. You weren't there. You don't know what it's like on the streets dealing with... He stopped. The word he did not say was almost audible. With these people, he finished. The courtroom went silent in the way that a room goes silent when something final has been said. Not the silence of shock, the silence of a thing that has been heard and recorded and cannot be taken back. Marsh set the remote control on the podium with quiet, precise care. He turned and looked at the jury. He did not speak. He did not need to. He looked at them for a moment, let the silence do its work, and walked to his chair. No further questions, he said. Ellison objected to the rebuttal witness with everything he had. Undisclosed. Improper timing. The defense had not had opportunity to prepare. Marsh's response was filed within 40 minutes. The witness's testimony addressed a specific factual claim raised in the defense's opening statement that Pruitt had additional grounds to perceive a ranger-trained individual as a heightened lethal threat. This claim could not have been anticipated in pre-trial disclosure. Furthermore, the witness had not been previously unavailable. He had been deliberately held back for a specific structural purpose which the prosecution was entitled to do with rebuttal witnesses under state rules of evidence. Judge Okafor read both filings. She looked at Ellison with the expression she wore when she had determined which attorney had the better of a legal argument. The defense opened this door, Mr. Ellison. The witness is permitted. Call your witness, Mr. Marsh. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Commander Victor Bryce walked down the center aisle in his Army Service uniform Class A, pressed to a precision that was not merely professional but ceremonial. He was 47 years old, broad in the shoulders, moving with the contained kinetic quality of a man whose body had been required to do serious things for a long time and had not forgotten the requirement. 4 rows of ribbons on his chest, silver oak leaves on his collar. The Ranger tab on his left shoulder, the small black and gold patch that in the Army was less a decoration than a credential, a statement of what the wearer had survived. He was followed into the courtroom by 14 men. They came in pairs, filling the last 2 rows of the gallery with the measured, coordinated movement of men who had spent years operating as a single organism. Different ages, different builds, different faces, unified by the posture and the uniform and the tab and the specific quality of stillness, they all carried the containment of men who had been to the worst places and returned from them without losing their composure. They settled into their seats in unison, a single smooth tide. The gallery was completely silent. Pruitt turned in his chair to look at the back of the room. He looked for 2 seconds before he turned back. His face had changed. The last residue of the smile was gone. His knuckles were white against the edge of the defense table. Marsh began with Bryce's service record, 22 years, 3 combat deployments, command of the battalion in which Marcus Webb had served for the last 4 years of his career. He had known Marcus for 8 years. Commander Bryce Marsh said the defense has argued that a Ranger-trained individual represents a heightened threat in a civilian context, that training in close-quarters combat would make such a person inherently more dangerous in a roadside encounter. What does the Ranger Regiment's training actually teach about civilian authority encounters? Bryce looked at the jury with the directness he brought to everything. The opposite of what the defense suggests. The regiment trains precision and discipline and restraint in every environment. In civilian contexts, Rangers are explicitly trained to comply with lawful authority, to de-escalate, to be the calmest person in any confrontation. The reason is practical. A Ranger who creates legal incidents at home is a Ranger who cannot deploy. The training is explicit and it is enforced. Would Marcus Webb's combat experience make him more likely to behave aggressively in a routine police encounter? A man with genuine combat experience has spent years learning to distinguish between a real threat and a perceived one, and to respond proportionately. The most combat-experienced people I have served with are also the most controlled in ambiguous situations. They know what actual danger looks like. They have calibrated responses. Staff Sergeant Webb's entire career was built on precision, restraint, and discipline. What the footage shows is exactly consistent with that training. Marsh then said, "Commander Bryce, I want to ask you about the evening of November 9th. Did you receive a call from Staff Sergeant Webb that night?" The courtroom shifted. This was not in the opening statement. Ellison sat forward. "I did," Bryce said. "When was this call?" 11:04 p.m. Approximately 14 minutes before the shooting. "And what did Staff Sergeant Webb tell you during this call?" Bryce looked at the jury. His voice was steady, clear, unhurried. "He told me he had picked up the rental vehicle at the terminal and was driving toward Route 9. He told me he had noticed a police cruiser following him without its headlights on for approximately 2 blocks after leaving the airport. He was not alarmed by it. He mentioned it the way he mentioned anything operationally relevant, as information worth noting." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him to document it." That was standard protocol for our personnel when dealing with potentially problematic interactions with local law enforcement. Note it, be compliant, keep your hands visible, let it resolve. "I told him I'd talk to him when he got home. He never called." "No." A pause. "He did not." The room was very still. Marsh let the silence sit for several seconds. Then, Commander, the defense has argued that Staff Sergeant Webb's posture in the moments before the shooting could have been interpreted as aggressive. Is that interpretation consistent with his training, his character, and what the footage shows, Jung? What the footage shows is a man doing exactly what his training, his character, and his professional experience all told him was the correct response to a tense authority encounter. Hands visible, voice calm, body still. Every movement announced before made. He had more combat experience than anyone in that parking lot, and he used it to make the officer feel safe. The most dangerous thing he did that night was reach for his wallet. Bryce paused. He looked at the jury. He saw the cruiser coming. He told me about it. He was not afraid, he was careful. He did everything right. And it didn't matter. There was nothing to cross-examine. Ellison tried twice to find traction and could not. He sat down. Pruitt was staring at the table. He was not thinking about the trial anymore. He was thinking about the phone call. He was thinking about the fact that Marcus Webb had seen the cruiser following him 14 minutes before the shooting, had noted it had called his commanding officer, had been told to document it. He was thinking about what it meant that a man he had dismissed as a nobody in a rental car had, in the 3 minutes and 40 seconds of a phone call, already put Dale Pruitt on record before Dale Pruitt ever turned on his spotlight. He had not shot a stranger who was alone and unprotected. He had shot a man who was already being watched. The 14 Rangers in the back rows sat in absolute silence. They had been notified by Bryce the night Marcus died. They had booked flights, arranged leave, coordinated with Langford and Marsh's office over 4 months of preparation. They had come not because anyone had asked them to come, but because Marcus Webb was one of theirs, and one of theirs was not a phrase the regiment used lightly. Pruitt did not look at them again. The following morning, before Ellison could call his first defense witness, Marsh stood and said, "The state calls Sergeant Wendell Oakes." The police union representative in the gallery went rigid. Ellison looked up from his notes with the expression of a man who has just heard something unexpected and is running calculations rapidly to determine how bad it is. Wendell Oakes was 41 years old, 15 years on the Calhoun Falls PD. And he had the specific look of a man who had not slept a full night in 8 months. Not guilt in the dramatic sense, exhaustion. The accumulated weight of knowing something and carrying it, of going home every night to a house where his 9-year-old daughter liked to draw pictures of him in his uniform, of eating dinner and watching television, and putting her to bed and sitting in the kitchen afterward in a silence that had nothing peaceful in it. He was not Glenn Staver. He had not directed anything. He had been the 4th officer on scene, arriving after Staver after 2 additional patrol units, and he had stood there and watched what happened and said nothing and carried it home. He testified to all of it with the flat, precise exhaustion of a man who has been deciding for 8 months to do this and is finally just doing it. What he watched Staver do in the store. The DVR. The boot heel on the SD card. Oakes had been close enough to see the specific grinding motion, had understood what it was in the moment, and said nothing. And the morning briefing. Sergeant Staver gathered the officers who had been on scene, Oakes said. He said the narrative was non-compliant. Suspect officer feared for his life. He said anyone who didn't see it that way didn't see anything. In the gallery, Glenn Staver rose from his seat. He was out on bail pending arraignment and had been permitted to attend as a civilian observer over his attorney's advice. He rose, and the words that came out of him were not articulate in the way of a man who has decided to speak. They were the words of a container that has been under too much pressure for too long and has finally failed. He called Oakes a traitor. He said the wall held or everyone went down. He said things that were simultaneously a confession and an accusation, that in their specific content named the structure of the cover-up and the chain of command and the sequence of decisions that had been made in the 40 minutes between the shots and the crime scene tape. He said them at volume in a live courtroom with a reporter's audio recorder running 3 feet from the gallery railing. 2 state troopers had him by the arms before he finished the second sentence. Okafor's gavel came down so hard that the sound of it in the court reporter's audio record would later be described by a journalist as sounding like a gunshot in a small room. "Remove that man," Okafor said without raising her voice, "and convey him directly to the State Attorney General's office. He has significantly complicated his own legal situation." Staver was walked out. The courtroom settled back into its specific quality of charged, contained silence. Ellison looked at his notes for a long time. "The defense has no questions for this witness, Your Honor." He took a breath. "The defense rests." Ellison closed on the only ground he had left, the fog of uncertainty. He was a professional, and he performed it professionally. the ambiguity of ground-level perception versus overhead footage, the unreliability of Oakes as an immunity-motivated witness, the possibility that in some fraction of some second there was something Pruitt perceived that the camera couldn't see. He spoke about the legal standard of reasonable doubt as if it were a moral obligation rather than a procedural one. He was thorough and he was exhausted, and he did not look at his client when he sat down. Marsh stood up and walked to the center of the room and said, "The 11 seconds." He did not explain. He didn't need to. The defense wants you to think about what was happening inside Officer Pruitt's mind in the moments before the shots. I am asking you to think about what was happening in the 11 seconds after them. After the situation, whatever Pruitt believed it was, had resolved. After the threat, if there ever was one, no longer existed. In those 11 seconds, Dale Pruitt did not render aid. He did not call for help. He did not kneel. He did not say a word to the man on the ground. He walked slowly toward the jury box. What he did was pick up his radio and say, "Suspect reached for a weapon." He narrated a justification. In the 11 seconds that a man who genuinely feared for his life might have spent in shock or in the desperate action of someone trying to undo something terrible, Dale Pruitt spent those 11 seconds building the story he needed to survive. He picked up Marcus's military ID from the exhibit table. He carried it to the jury box railing and set it down face up. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb called his commanding officer 14 minutes before the shooting. He had already seen the cruiser following him without headlights. He told Commander Bryce about it. He was careful. He was exactly as trained, as calm, as professional in those 14 minutes as he was in the 6 minutes at Pump 3. He did everything right from the moment he saw the cruiser to the moment his hand moved toward his back pocket. He stepped back. Pruitt told him he should have stayed in his lane. Marcus Webb spent 9 years driving into the worst lanes on Earth so that people like Dale Pruitt could drive safely in theirs. He had 47 miles left to drive. He was going home to his wife and his daughter. He looked at the jury without looking away. Bring back the verdict that tells Rochelle Webb and Zoe Webb and the 14 men in the back rows of this gallery and every person in this country who has ever been afraid of the wrong thing in the dark that the law applies, that it applies to everyone, that it applies even here. He went back to his chair. He sat down. He folded his hands on the table. In the back 2 rows, the 14 Rangers sat in the absolute stillness they had maintained for 3 weeks, and the room around them was completely quiet. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 19 minutes. Pruitt spent those hours in the courthouse holding area 3 floors below the waiting room, where Rochelle sat with a cold cup of coffee between her palms, and Conrad Marsh across from her, and Langford beside her, and nobody saying much that mattered. Pruitt paced 3 steps one way, 3 steps back, and sat and stood and paced again. He had spent 17 years in a profession in which the waiting was done by other people. He had been the one who decided when things were over. Now there was nothing to do. In the county holding cell that Pruitt occupied, there were walls on 4 sides and a ceiling above them, and the specific silence of a space designed to eliminate variables. No phone, no Holloway, no Ellison, no blue wall. He had called Holloway from the defense table during a recess, and Holloway had not answered. Ellison, when Pruitt had grabbed his arm as the jury filed out, had looked at him with the professional compassion of a man who understood that his role in this story was functionally over. Pruitt was alone in the specific way that a man who has built his entire identity on institutional protection discovers he is alone when the institution withdraws. The intercom buzzed at 4:19 p.m. The re-entry of the gallery was a filling up bodies returning to seats, cameras repositioning the collective intake of 200 people who had been waiting for something and were now about to receive it. The 14 Rangers filed back to the last 2 rows. Rochelle took her seat. Marsh placed his hand briefly on the table near hers, not touching, just near. Pruitt was escorted in by 2 state troopers, who looked at him with the flat professionalism of men who understood that he was no longer a brother officer. He walked to the defense table. He sat. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at Rochelle. He looked at the table and then at Ellison, who gave him nothing useful. Judge Okafor entered. The room stood, then sat. She looked at the jury box. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson stood. Martha Aldridge, 57 years old, retired high school history teacher. She held a single sheet of paper. Her hands were completely steady. We have your honor. The defendant will rise. Ellison helped Pruitt to his feet by the elbow. Pruitt stood. He was trembling with the fine, continuous shaking that accumulates over months of sustained exposure and finds its moment of maximum expression in the moment of maximum consequence. Martha Aldridge looked at him directly. Her voice was clear and needed no amplification. On the first count of the indictment, murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant Dale Pruitt guilty. The gallery erupted. Okafor's gavel cut through it in 2 strikes. On the second count, official misconduct, guilty. Another wave, another silence. On the third count, conspiracy to tamper with evidence, guilty. 3 words, 3 times. The third landed differently from the first 2 with the weight of finality, the specific gravity of a thing completed. Pruitt's legs went out from under him in stages of progressive failure, and he hit the chair on the way down, and the chair scraped loudly on the hardwood, and he sat with his face in his hands, his shoulders moving, a sound coming out of him that was audible even in the rising noise of the gallery. In the back 2 rows, the 14 Rangers rose, not in chaos, not in cheering. They rose together in the single fluid motion they had been executing in coordination for years, and they stood there in their dress uniforms with the stillness they always carried and said absolutely nothing. They simply stood. The gallery noise died around them, the way noise dies when something more significant than sound enters a room. Jurors looked at them. The reporters looked at them. Judge Okafor looked at them. Pruitt, from behind his hands, did not look at anything. Rochelle opened her eyes. She had been sitting with her eyes closed since the foreperson stood. Now she opened them and saw the 14 men standing in the back rows in their uniforms and their silence, and she looked at them until she couldn't anymore. She pressed the laminated photograph against her chest. Marcus laughing at the beach. Zoe on his shoulders with her arms spread wide and certain, and she held it there for a long moment. She did not cry. She had been carrying this for almost a year. She exhaled a long and slow release as if the weight of it had been redistributed at last into something she did not have to hold alone. Judge Okafor sentenced immediately, invoking her discretion, given the overwhelming nature of the evidence and what she characterized as a complete and demonstrated absence of remorse through the proceedings. She looked down at the man at the defense table, the slumped, trembling remnant of the officer who had stood over Marcus Webb for 11 seconds, and picked up his radio with an expression that was beyond contempt. It was the expression of a reckoning. Dale Pruitt, you were given a badge, and you used it as a weapon. You took from this community a man who had given it, and this country, everything. And then you spent every resource available to you trying to ensure that the truth would never be known. I sentence you to 28 years to life in the state penitentiary without possibility of parole consideration before the mandatory minimum. You are remanded immediately. The gavel came down. The handcuffs closed around Pruitt's wrists with the specific sound of metal engaging metal, the ratcheting click that he had heard 1,000 times from the other side. The state troopers turned him toward the side door. He looked back over his shoulder at the gallery. He did not find a sympathetic face. He found the cameras. He found the community members who had driven from neighboring counties to be present. He found the 14 Rangers standing in the back rows. And he found Rochelle, who was looking at him with an expression that was not triumph and not gloating. It was the expression of a woman who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just been permitted to set it down. She looked at him with the specific, quiet authority of someone who has survived something he tried to make unsurvivable. He looked away first. The side door closed. The conviction was not the end. It was the first brick removed from a wall that had been holding up a structure. Conrad Marsh had been building what came next in parallel for months, using the evidentiary record that Oakes's testimony had opened the specific chain of command, the morning briefing, the 40-minute window between the shots and the crime scene unit. The phone call between Staver and Galt's office at 12:43 a.m. on the night of the shooting, which lasted 8 minutes and which Marsh's team had subpoenaed from the carrier records. That call was the thread that led from Staver to Galt, from the parking lot to the chief's office, from a single cover-up to the machinery that had made the cover-up not only possible, but expected. Chief Raymond Galt was federally indicted 7 weeks after the verdict. He resigned the morning the indictment was unsealed. His pension would have vested the following day. It did not. Glenn Staver entered a guilty plea 6 weeks after that, accepting a 12-year sentence in exchange for his full cooperation. He gave prosecutors the complete chain, the 4 additional officers who had participated in the scene management that night, the internal processes by which Pruitt's 9 prior complaints had been administratively buried, the specific and long-standing relationship between Frank Reeves in internal affairs and Chip Holloway in the union that had made the burial routine. The evidence was documentary recorded and specific. Staver had been the architect's primary contractor for years, and he knew where everything was. The 4 additional officers were charged. 2 took pleas. 2 went to trial and lost. Chip Holloway entered a federal cooperation agreement, surrendered his pension, and accepted 2 years of supervised release. He was described in Marsh's filing as the financial infrastructure of a culture of impunity. The union's legal defense fund, $6 million built over years and deployed in the service of shielding officers from accountability, was frozen by federal court order as a potential instrumentality of the conspiracy. The legal academics who wrote about it disagreed about whether the theory would hold on appeal. It was still frozen when this story ends. The Calhoun Falls Police Department was placed under a federal consent decree. An independent monitor was appointed. The department had 6 months to demonstrate compliance or face expanded federal oversight. What Pruitt had done on a November night at a gas station on Route 9, what he had done in 11 seconds and in the months of constructed lies that followed, had not merely ended one man's freedom. It had pulled at a single thread and unfolded something that had been woven into the institutional fabric of Calhoun Falls for over a decade. The wall had looked solid from the outside. It had not been. On a Saturday morning in early April, the soccer fields on the south side of Calhoun Falls were loud with the cheerful noise of children who had not yet learned to be self-conscious about their enthusiasm. The grass carried the vivid green of early spring, and the sky was the pale, clear blue that feels like a promise kept after a long winter. Rochelle Webb sat in the second row of the metal bleachers with a thermos of coffee warming both hands and watched her daughter run. Zoe wore number 22 Marcus's Ranger unit number, which Rochelle had requested at the start of the season and which Zoe had chosen without being asked because she said it made her feel like Dad was running with her. Zoe sprinted down the left side of the field with the ball, and her arms swung wide as she ran the way they always had, as if she were halfway to flight. Rochelle watched her and thought, he would have been so loud right now. Marcus at a soccer game was a man who had been conspicuously composed in almost every other context of his life, and who became at his daughter's games entirely and unapologetically uninhibited, standing when he should sit, disputing calls from 30 feet away, receiving Rochelle's amused elbow in his ribs with complete unrepentance. She thought about it with the particular tenderness that was not quite grief anymore, or was grief, but grief that had learned to share space with something else, something that was not the opposite of sorrow, but that could exist alongside it. She did not cry. She drank her coffee and watched her daughter play. Zoe had scored twice and was not done. Commander Victor Bryce was 2 rows up in civilian clothes, his own thermos, his phone camera raised for most of the second half. He had attended every home game since January. The first time he had arrived early and sat at the far end of the bleachers and kept a respectful distance, and Rochelle had let him, and by February, the distance had compressed naturally, in the way distances do when 2 people are present in the same space repeatedly and share a single point of reference larger than anything on the surface. After the final whistle, Zoe came up the bleachers in 3 bounds and arrived slightly out of breath and asked him, as she asked every time, if he had a new one. A new story about her dad. She asked every time. He always had one ready. Today's was from a training exercise in 2019. Marcus had been assigned to negotiate a mock surrender from an adversary in a scenario specifically designed to produce the opposite outcome, and he had done it by asking the mock adversary a genuine question about something unrelated to the exercise and actually listening to the answer. The scenario coordinator had stopped the drill and asked Marcus to explain his reasoning. Marcus had shrugged and said, "People stop fighting when they feel heard." The coordinator had written it into the curriculum the following month. Zoe listened to this with her arms crossed and her serious face on. Then she laughed a short, delighted burst. "That sounds exactly like him," she said, with the authority of someone who knew. Rochelle looked at Bryce over Zoe's head briefly and without performance, and he gave her a small nod that contained more than could be said, and she turned and walked Zoe toward the car. Dale Pruitt arrived at Halloran Correctional Facility on a cold Monday in January in a state transport van processed without ceremony into the machinery of a place that had no interest in who he had been. Photographed, fingerprinted, property confiscated, uniform issued. He was no longer Officer Pruitt. He was no longer the closer. The system gave him a number, and that number was what the system would call him for 28 years, in a place where his badge meant nothing and his reputation had arrived well before he did, because news travels inside correctional facilities with a speed that has nothing to do with technology. And many of the men at Halloran had experienced at some point in their lives the particular brand of authority that Dale Pruitt had spent 17 years wielding in Calhoun Falls. His cell door closed at 4:17 on a Monday afternoon. The lock engaged. The sound of it filled the cell, and then the silence after. It was its own kind of statement, complete, heavy, final. Outside Halloran's walls 90 miles south. A woman and her daughter were driving home from soccer in the morning light. Music was playing something Zoe had chosen, which turned out to be a children's song about not giving up, which Zoe was singing along to with complete conviction and absolute absence of self-consciousness. The windows were cracked, despite the April chill, because Zoe had asked for them to be cracked because she liked the feeling of the wind on her face when the car was moving. Rochelle had rolled them down without asking why. The road ran ahead of them. The windows were open. She left them open. If this story moved you, if you believe that the truth matters and that justice, however long it takes, is worth pursuing, subscribe to our channel. Every story we tell is about what becomes possible when someone refuses to be silent.